is on his way.
Sorry. Hi. Hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to ASNE's Expert Series. My name is Michelle Lee. I'm a reporter at The Washington Post. I write for The Fact Checker, and I'm also the Senior Vice President of the Asian American Journalists Association. Today, we're here to discuss Trump and the press and how newsrooms are tackling challenges and the changes while covering the new administration. Covering the Trump administration poses extraordinary challenges for newsrooms, from truth squatting presidential tweets to tracking White House infighting to penetrating a wide-ranging special counsel investigation. Today's panelists are here. We're live. It's Elisabeth Bumiller, Washington Bureau Chief of the New York Times, Karey Van Hall, Managing Editor at Politico, and Scott Wilson, National Editor at The Washington Post. We're excited to cover a lot of topics for the next hour, but we're also interested in hearing from audience questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to tweet to @newseditor, and we'll monitor your questions and answer them throughout. So let's get started. Let's start talking about the workload. There's a lot of news coming out of the administration every day. So how are you guys managing all this torrent of news? Let's start with Scott.
I was hoping you'd start with Elisabeth so I could figure out how they're doing it. But we're trying. You know, it is a daily challenge in large part because so much of it is unpredictable. It's hard to know what course the day is going to take. Yesterday's a pretty good example of writing about Afghanistan and trying to write about policy and consequences in the morning. And then at 10:30 last night, our time, you know, taking on what the president, a real maybe return to form for the president in a speech in Phoenix that felt a lot like a campaign rally, particularly sharp on attacks on the media again. And so it is. They're full days. They're long days. We've tried to manage it by staffing up at the White House, 6 people covering it, which is much more than we've ever had before. At the same time, we had freelancers on the ground there. We had a National Staff America desk reporter on the ground in Phoenix. So it's really throwing a lot of people at these stories every day. I think if you look at the Post, you see a lot of multiple byline stories. And so there's a sharing of the workload a little bit along those lines, but it's also necessity.
Thanks, Scott. How about you, Karey?
One thing that Scott just mentioned about the predictability, I mean, it's been really fascinating. I mean, seeing it's almost kind of a predictable unpredictability in some ways. I mean, we do know that typically Trump, you know, when he watches Fox and Friends in the morning and has these reactions to it, that you know, we do need to treat his Twitter feed as presidential statements in many ways, so that we do have full staffing first thing in the morning, a little bit before 6 a.m. We know also for weekend coverage as well that Trump Saturday morning tends to put out a lot of statements and things that will kind of shape the narrative for over the weekend. So we do know that we need people on times like that. I think also with you saying that's a torrent of news, that's also a challenge for us, is that, you know, we can't have the breaking news team, the White House team, be able to do these kind of quick pops throughout the day. But we also want to make sure that we're digesting the coverage and kind of making linkages and telling kind of like the larger narrative of the Trump presidency. So making sure that we've got that built-in capacity as well to do that, stand back and kind of tell the, you know, capture that moment and tell that larger narrative of Trump's presidency.
Elisabeth?
Well, I would agree with both of those. We also have staffed up a lot in the Washington Bureau. We now, like the Post, have 6 White House correspondents. That's an all-time record. And we've also added people early in the morning and late at night. So we now have a case at 6 a.m. every morning. That's very unusual for us. Somebody to deal with Trump's tweets right away. If the White House reporters can't get to them, we have somebody here, you know, fully caffeinated, you know, a file open in the computer. And usually she starts out with it's Eileen Sullivan. She starts out with the first take on a Trump tweet, and then we go from there. Same way in the evenings, we can very late at night. We have somebody here till midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., depending on what's happening. There are editors as well. Last night is the perfect example of Scott was saying. We started out with Afghanistan, ended up very late at night with Trump's rally in Phoenix. I was up at home dealing with it till 12:15 or so. I'm also up much earlier than I've ever been up before to deal with the early morning stuff. And I think it's a staffing challenge. It's a challenge of hours. It's also just at the same time, so keeping up with it in real time, but also being able to pull back with the longer stories, enterprise stories, investigative stories that's going on in real time, along with the breaking news. And the one last thing in terms of really different about it, and I've said this before, is the relentlessness of it. You know, in the last 10 days, we had gone from, you know, near nuclear war in North Korea, or seemingly, to a civil war in this country, to Afghanistan, and then to this rally. That is more news than we used to deal with in 6 months. So, and it happens, that's what's so difficult. Again, we never know when it's coming. The White House doesn't operate by the normal rules of the White House is in terms of, you know, planned events and statements and briefings. And plus, it's been nonstop. And of course, it's August, but you have not as full staff here.
So when you guys talk about trying to still do the deep dives and pull out and make sure that we're still doing enterprise work, how do you make sure that that enterprise story is still going to be relevant in the next week or even in a couple days, given how quickly the news cycle goes? So how do you balance that, being able to do the dailies and the enterprise, making sure that the enterprise that you're planning for is still going to be something worth writing about in a week or a month?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah.
Well, I won't say that we've been, you know, perfect on this. We've lost stories because enterprise stories because we've been slow. You know, as Elisabeth just said, if we're still writing about Charlottesville as the event that's the peg to write about race relations or a reckoning with history in the United States, 2 or 3 things have happened since then that should be informing that story. So we lose purchase on the story if we're not doing it in 24, 48 hours. You know, Karey and Elisabeth, their publications I both see, and I mean, I read all the time, but the way that they do their reconstruction stories on key decisions, those were things that a decision would happen on Tuesday and we'd all kind of shoot for, not so much Politico, who's always been faster, but shoot for maybe the Sunday story. Those are the next cycle stories now. And so you have to be, the metabolism has sped up so much. And again, I get back to really having to organize people around targets. So you've got the day story, you've got the day analysis, that's a group, and then immediately you're assigning the enterprise off that so that you can get it within, you know, 24, 48 hours, or you've moved on to something else. And the reporting that you've been doing on that subject has been overtaken by the relentlessness, to use Elisabeth's word, of the news cycle, and you're writing in the wrong stream suddenly. So it's really about speed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We had this story. You're right. Reconstructs used to be the big set pieces for the Sunday paper. We were on the Afghan speech. We scattered a reconstruct by Mark Landler, and Maggie right away. Normally we would have thought about it. We would have spent, you know, a couple days on it, but no, that was on the sched, and that was actually up before the president started speaking about Afghanistan, because a reconstruct obviously involved things that happened in the past, and so that was our plan. The other reality of that was that the president wasn't going to start speaking until 9 p.m., which is right on top of our print deadline, our first print deadline. So we were going to be squeezed. We needed something really substantive. We still think about the print on the front page when we weren't going to have much from the president. In terms of staffing, you know, you do it with more staff, which is why there's 100 people in it. That's an all-time high. So you've got some reporters working in dailies. you know, the White House team, there's 6 reporters at any given time on the day story, because the day story lasts so long now. And then there's another 4 who are working on enterprise, again, but they're working on it faster than they used to work on it. There's sometimes when you do an enterprise story and all of a sudden the moment passes, sometimes we've just sat on it and waited for the moment to come back again. I know we all do that. It works sometimes. Boom, Trump says something, and suddenly the story that's been sitting around for 2 weeks has a new relevance. We dust it off. And
I mean, I do also find the reconstruct to be a fascinating question because, you know, speaking to speed, it almost is also in real time. I mean, I think, you know, Twitter has changed it so dramatically. You've got, you know, the major reporters from all the major media outlets that in real time are sharing these backstory details that are fascinating and great. And, you know, you want that reconstruct that's really robust, tells that inside story and does it in a very, you know, robust fashion, but it's so intensely competitive as all these details are coming out in real time. I think we've also had a lot of challenge with some of the departures from the White House as well. When you've got, you know, different factions of the White House telling you different versions of the circumstances of a certain individual's exit. And so, you know, you have to make these judgment calls in real time about how you present what at times can appear like conflicting information. So it's, you know, to some degree, it can be an iterative process, even with these reconstructs, and you want to make sure that you're giving as accurate of a representation as possible while still being very competitive in the process. So I think that that's something that a lot of us are still working through.
Thanks, guys. I'm hearing a lot about, you know, just how busy it is and how flexible that your staff needs to be and willing to drop things at a certain point and come back to it another time and make sure that you're kind of going with the news cycle. And I'm curious to know how challenging it is to kind of help your staff balance this too. Like, how much are you considering you're making sure that your most high-profile White House reporters are still getting the break that they need so that they're not getting burned out? Because I know all of us are kind of reaching that point where it's like, okay, it's August. It was supposed to slow down a little bit, but it's not. It's North Korea, then Afghanistan, and then Phoenix. So how are you balancing making sure that your staff isn't burning out amidst all of this?
Well, I could like to speak to that first because Peter Baker, formerly of the Washington Post, as am I actually, you know, he's on vacation right now. We miss him desperately, and I am stopping myself every morning from picking up the phone to call him. But right before Peter went on vacation, here's an example. Peter, I don't remember what the story was that it was happening 2 Fridays ago, but Peter wrote through it all day long. Does anybody remember what was going on? It was some crisis of the moment. Who knows? Anyway, whatever it was, Peter wrote and wrote and wrote, updated, wrote it perfectly for print. And that was Friday night. And our print deadline for Sunday, for the Bulldog edition, is basically 9 a.m. Saturday. And Peter then wrote 2 A1 Sunday stories overnight, Friday night into Saturday morning, filed one at 7 a.m. and filed one at 8 a.m. And as he was driving towards Nantucket on his vacation. I have not bothered him since then. You can imagine. So yes, there's a lot of wear and tear on our staff, and I try and really respect vacation. It's hard, people have got to get rest. They get short-tempered. They get, you know, it's a real problem. But I've just told you with that anecdote how I've tried to solve it, at least in one case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to follow Elisabeth, the same, and it's not fair invoking Peter Baker either. I'm sorry. But he's superhuman, but yes, I mean, and to, you know, short-tempered. Do people, you know, to your question, Michelle, about, you know, I know we all want our best people to make sure they finish each year with a body of work that they're really proud of, and not just a sense that they kept up with the news extremely well. And that's a hard balance to make, and you do make decisions based on whether or not they're satisfied in that. The other is these reporters are really right now, and extremely dedicated and feel challenged by the administration. And it's remarkable to wake up every morning and seeing the people that were up until midnight the previous night. First ones in the morning here as well, working on their next piece, their next follow, which happened just this morning. So, you know, it's extraordinary credit to the reporters at I think all of our publications that are doing this work right now, because I often don't know how they're doing it.
I do have kind of a few thoughts on that. I mean, one is with so many people, especially in August, people on vacation, trying to accommodate that. It does kind of provide an opportunity for other reporters to step up, which has been pretty interesting. I mean, I do think we, regardless, need to take the approach that the whole newsroom covers the Trump presidency, because it is so sprawling and covers so many areas, even sometimes a little more so than prior presidencies. So it's been interesting seeing other reporters kind of you know, take on a larger role when some of our core reporters are on vacation. And secondly, also, I think we tried to take almost a wire service approach. I think last week we had a lot of people off, and for those reporters who are off but still talking to sources, trying to set up kind of a process where they can send in feeds. They don't have to anchor the whole story. We can have a main writer, so it takes a little bit of pressure off of them, but we still get the really valuable sources and insight they can provide.
Great, thanks so much. So we can move on to planning, talking a little deeper about these different areas that you guys have already covered. So we're all working really hard to cover Trump and make sure that everything is thorough enough, enterprising enough. What are your newsrooms doing to make sure that your individual coverage stands out? Like, I'd like to know more about your philosophy toward covering the Trump administration and what you hope kind of becomes the defining work after this administration for your newsroom. We can start with Karey.
Yeah, so as far as having coverage stand out, I mean, that is one of our primary challenges because it's such an intensely competitive environment. I think one thing that we've touched on so far is speed. I think that's really one of the primary things in taking this iterative approach of you know, getting out the initial story and then building it out. That, you know, if we have information that we can't sit on it. Before, we would try to find some larger kind of theme, this bigger enterprise frame, and we still do that on certain occasions when we don't hear footsteps on information, but other times you just know it's too intensely competitive, you have to go with the information. But I think that also speaks to the need for more vetting and bulletproofing to make sure that you're not going too fast with information. So speed, you know, there's a trade-off that you really kind of, each day we make judgment calls on. I think also, as far as standing out, each newsroom knowing what your strengths are and knowing what, probably more importantly, what your strengths are not. If you've got a reporter from a competing publication that's really owning a certain area of the Trump presidency, doesn't mean that we won't participate in it. It just means that maybe we don't dedicate as many resources to it. But Politico, you know, we've got a really big policy operation and some very strong policy reporters. So really relying upon them. I think also there's so much fascination with like the Palace intrigue and the White House and the West Wing, and we cover that very robustly, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening at the federal agencies as well that perhaps doesn't get quite as much attention. And when we've got reporters really richly operating all these agencies to tell these stories that federal workforce and what's happening with regulations, these are the things that are definitely going to have quite a long shelf life. So we want to make sure that we're telling those stories as robustly as possible too.
Elisabeth, how about you? What's your strength?
Well, we hope that our coverage of the Russia investigation stands out, as well as our coverage of the presidency writ large. And also, there's a lot more areas I would talk about. One is the Russia investigation, which the other one is just this covering the scope of the presidency and changes in the presidency under this president. Third would be the deregulation that's going on in all the agency. And the fourth, of course, is the Palace intrigue. I think the Russia investigation right now is the most important. We've got a Washington investigations editor, Mark Mazzetti, brilliant reporter and editor, and we are obviously in a pitched battle with the Washington Post over scoop after scoop of that. But that we of energy and ambition into that coverage, not just the daily scoops, but also the bigger pieces on other characters involved in that investigation. Did a story over the weekend on one of the Russians who was at the meeting at Trump Tower. That'll be one place where I hope we stand out. Another would be, again, I mentioned Peter Baker again, is just the covering the presidency and how this is so radically different from any other American presidency so far, and how Trump is changing the presidency. We cover that in real time, but also we like to step back and look at that. Thirdly would be, again, we have a team in New York that's looking, Eric Lippen's part of it here though, it's looking at the kind of deregulation that's going on in the government under Trump that you don't necessarily see every day, but it's quite real. It's going on at certainly at EPA, at the other agencies. And finally, the palace intrigue stories, who stabbed who in the back. They're certainly crowd pleasers, obviously. Maggie Haberman and Glenn Thrush are masters at those. But they also tell you, the larger point of those stories, which I hope stand out too, is just that, again, how different this presidency is, and the kind of chaos we're seeing in the White House is actually unusual and historic. So that's how I hope it would stand out.
Scott?
Unfortunately, I hope we stand out in many of the same ways that Elisabeth wants to stand out, which makes for a very competitive atmosphere, which I know has been good for us. On outside of the Beltway, our coverage is really trying to explain the country that Trump is governing and is responding to Trump, and how the country understands Trump. I think that there's been a lot of criticism about the media's coverage of the election. I feel like our coverage of the election and Karey and Elisabeth's coverage of the election was excellent. I do feel like maybe before the election, we misunderstood in some ways what was happening in the country. And so we're really trying to understand that much more. And I hope we're doing some work this year that will stand out in that regard. I mean, as a principle, we need to be telling people things about the government, especially the secret government, that they don't know and they need to know. And that distinguishes our work. Some of the work that I've been proudest of around our Russia investigation coverage has been in that vein. I'm envious of both Elisabeth and Karey's coverage of agencies and the changing government, how Trump is actually changing the bureaucracy in the erstwhile Steve Bannon's phrase, deconstructing the administrative state. I want us to do more and deeper and better work on that. And that should distinguish our coverage. I'm not sure it does yet, but I want to. And so those are some of my priorities.
Regarding planning, can you guys talk about what you're doing to coordinate with the different departments, especially as you're working with your news staff a lot, but there must be room to also coordinate with your style or features writers or international desks and the different desks that are all now coming together to make sure that your Trump coverage is robust. Elisabeth, do you want to start?
Sure, I can answer that. That's a good question. I think we can all. Right now, it seems like everybody wants to cover the Trump story, from the fashion people to international to national to metro. So everybody wants to be in the soccer ball. So yes, we do coordinate. Sometimes we crash into each other, but we do try to coordinate. There's a lot of coordination with the foreign staff, obviously, because when Trump goes overseas, our reporters who travel with Trump, the White House reporters, then report to foreign for those trips. And there's a lot of collaboration even when we're here. For example, this morning, Mark Mazzetti had the aforementioned brilliant editor and writer, a news analysis about what Trump said about India and the problems that will present with Pakistan as they try and solve, after 16 years, the problems in Afghanistan, the conflict there. He worked with one of our reporters on the ground in Pakistan, so and that was combined. So that's how we do it. You know, it's a challenge. I won't dismiss it. To work with, we work with the with the financial section, BizDay, on a lot of the stories about Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin. It just involved a lot of conversations with editors early in the day. That's usually the best way to coordinate and head off the train wrecks that inevitably occur in our business. If that helps anybody. But I want to say one last thing. Collaboration is when it is really good, because what it does is it brings in the best resources of the paper. We have enormous resources here, you know, huge number. What's the size of our newsroom? 1,300 people. So if you can bring in the best of people from Washington and foreign and BizDay into some fantastic story, that's great. And that's one thing we have at the time, we really have going for us.
Yeah, just to add to that, Elisabeth has a bigger challenge in some ways because she's remote from the main newsroom. So I imagine it's even trickier in some ways. But we do have, you know, we have these, because things are happening so quickly and because so many staffs want to be involved, the sort of twice a day story conference where you used to get together to talk about everyone's plans and make sure everyone was coordinated are, you know, useful yet anachronistic in some ways. I mean, so much is happening in real time. And rather than repeat a lot of what Elisabeth said, we're facing, you know, very similar challenges and trying to address them in similar ways. We also have a problem of standards across the newsroom, right? So we're, you know, if we're all covering the Trump administration, we all need to abide by certain standards of objectivity and language, whether it's a style writer or a White House reporter. We'd like to, you know, the tone may be different at times, but we can't be gratuitous in one section and not in the other. We're all held to the same standard. And in some ways, that's almost a bigger challenge because it's so hard to monitor that when, you know, you're publishing 300-400 stories a day, many of them about Trump, many of them reporters with very different sensibilities and very different missions, and yet we're sort of answerable to all of it. And so that still takes a lot more coordinating on our end.
I'd actually like to get into that some more about objectivity. And this is something that a lot of people have asked me to address in this chat, and I'm glad that you brought it up. What are you doing to make sure that your newsroom is being fair and accurate and objective while still pointing out the changes under this administration in a fair and accurate way? And how do you make sure that your staff is remaining you know, as objective as possible, especially on social media? Karey?
I can answer that.
We can start with Karey because we haven't heard from you.
Okay. No, I mean, it's obviously it's something that you do want to monitor quite closely. And it is, I mean, it's incredibly important with any presidency. I think with this one, there's a higher level of scrutiny. I do think the core thing is adjectives, and in copy, just making sure that you don't have these excessive adjectives, that you're not taking cheap shots. You know, we are not inside the president's head. So sometimes I think you see some coverage that will assume what he's thinking or his motivations. And I think that's something that we have to guard against as well. Then again, I do think we need to be very straightforward when there is a false statement that is put out there. And, you know, that's something that I think we address head on. We present the facts that we can present, and you know, readers, it's upon them to make their own judgments. You know, there are many different formats of editorials, op-eds and such, but we want to make sure for core news coverage that it's very straightforward and objective as the highest priority for us. And then also social media feeds too, that we make sure for reporters and editors that that does reflect back upon the reporting. So that also is something that needs to be closely watched.
Elizabeth?
Sure. I would say it's a constant challenge. I mean, just yesterday I talked to a reporter about the reporter's tweets that were becoming very opinionated. This is something we have to watch because some of the reporters have huge followings, and so they will say something, will tweet something out that they wouldn't necessarily say in the Times, but it's all of a tweet. So we have to watch that. It's a challenge. I think on the every day you try and put out the most accurate, informed report possible, and there's a shifting view on what is acceptable and not among many editors at the New York Times. We debate this every day. We're doing it last night. There's certain adjectives that were used last night. I was again up at midnight having debates about how we were characterizing Trump last night. So it's a give and take. I think there's two things I want to say about this. One is that we have twice used the word, said that Trump lied about something, and both of those times, those were calls made by Dean Buckday, the executive editor, right above my pay grade. We don't know, in the past, what we've always said is the president, his statement was inaccurate, but saying a president lied implies a motive, that you know what's in the president's head. In this case, made by Dean because the first time was when Trump kept repeating that Obama had not been born in the country, and the second case was when Trump kept repeating that 3 million people had voted illegally. And in Dean's view, this was so apparently false, and Trump had said it over so many times, it was so sustained that we called it what it was. We haven't done that since. We do it very carefully. But that is the kind of line we walk, that we've been, that's the kind of line we've been walking. That's what we've been trying to balance in the last 7 or 8 months since we've been president. And again, it's an ongoing daily conversation with reporters and editors about, one last thing, we do also now have, the Post has had Glenn Kessler for a long time, but we now have a reporter, Linda Q, who's our fact check reporter, and she writes several times a week saying Trump said this, and here are the facts.
Thanks. I work with Glenn Kessler on the fact checker, and I've experienced that as well. Just last night, I was tweeting out old fact checks that we had done from like last week or 2 weeks ago that Trump was repeating, and I wanted to tweet it out in real time so that people can have that additional context as they're listening. And people were tweeting back at me saying, well, why are you live checking Trump when you never did this for Obama? But that's just not the case. We're not real-time live fact-checking Trump. We're not giving Pinocchios in real time. I'm just adding additional context that we've already reported before. But now people are paying attention to the fact-checking even more, and it's just getting a lot of attention. So we've been, just been objectively tweeting out stuff that we've done before and telling people that Obama remains our most fact-checked politician because he was the president, and we continue to fact-check the president as we did for President Obama. So that's how we've been handling it at Fact Checker. But Scott, do you want to speak to this too?
Well, I think that Elisabeth and Karey, that is great advice all around it. I mean, the adjectives in particular, I say that so often in here. Just let's try to lose the adjectives as much as possible. And I think to your point, Michelle, I mean, this is about consistency, and I think it is easy, as headlong as this administration feels, to make sure that we realize what preceded it. And there are, and that's a measure of fairness, right? I mean, Obama was hardly great on leak investigations. It was not the most transparent administration that's ever been. All kinds of things that we just want to make sure that we're not holding this president to a standard we didn't hold the previous one. And then I'll say something obvious, but it's you just can't be wrong today. You can't be wrong on big things, especially. and it amplifies, it discredits. We're all working at top speed on complicated subjects, trying to be fair, trying to have the conversations that Elisabeth just described they had at the New York Times over characterizing something as a lie. And yet, our mistakes are so amplified right now that being wrong is worse than it's ever been. And it's just something that keeps me up at night, and I'm sure keeps us all up at night. And it's something we just have to guard against more than ever. And that's one of the things we're trying to work on as much as we can here, avoiding the mistake that will be used to undermine a lot of our good reporting.
So I just got an audience question. How are your subscribers and what's your traffic looking like nowadays? And what's the feedback like from your readers, favorable, unfavorable? I'm sure everyone would love to talk about their subscribers and their wonderful readers.
I'll say that it's our audience is very good, and our subscribers are way up. I guess I would only add to that. I know Karey and Elisabeth are seeing similar things in big spikes, and it's gratifying. What is interesting is when new subscribers are asked why they're subscribing, many of them do say because they want to support the First Amendment and reporting that's expensive but that matters. And I'm sure Politico and the New York Times are hearing the same things. But that's gratifying, and it's the kind of response that I think encourages a lot of people who are working hard here to keep working hard.
I do think the issue of feedback is an interesting one, because the reporters get a lot of feedback over Twitter. We have email systems set up for it, and I do think it's something that we need to be cognizant of too for reporters, because I think the feedback at times can get to them too. I mean, it's a lot of times very heated feedback that comes directly at them. So we want to make sure that we keep up the engagement with readers. That's such a critical part of what we do. But I do think we need to guard against some reporters being bombarded by, at times, what can be a deluge of negative feedback. That at times is just not constructive.
Sure. The failing New York Times is, as Trump calls us, is we're doing well right now, and our digital subscriptions are very high, very up. I think our total subscription rate is 3.3 million, which is hard to imagine just a couple of years ago. We're aggressively looking for new readers all over the world. Big push in Canada and Australia. So yeah, Trump has been very good for the failing New York Times, as he called us. And the question is, of course, how long this will be sustained. We know, all of us know now from the numbers that we have, how much Trump drives the coverage. I mean, it's the top 10 stories every day are all of these about Trump. And so, but we're still doing other kinds of journalism. He looks at international stories, business stories. So the question is, I just don't know how long this is going to last. I hope that all these subscribers stay with us, and but then they do see it. They do see it as something that's now. Some of them see it as a civic duty to read the New York Times. It's a nice change from a few years ago.
Thank you. Another audience question. So all of these newsrooms have lots of resources in their major national outlets. What advice do you have for smaller newsrooms who are also covering the impacts of the Trump administration for local markets?
Well, I hesitate to tell anybody what to do, but I guess I would say that if you're covering Trump in the local market, I mean, this is obvious to anybody who's already doing it. You want to cover the effects on your community, and they're out there. The effects of on the Affordable Care Act, that's what it's gone through, the effects on the local environment. I think that would be enforcement with the changes to the Justice Department. Those are just three things I would look at.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, and you know, that kind of work. Yeah, I'd stay away from the stuff that feels well covered by you know, national media organizations, and do the local. And look, the local helps people like me enormously in thinking about how we might do better in covering the country and the effects and consequences of what is happening here in Washington, which is sometimes hard for us to connect, given Beltway fever, et cetera. So I would encourage that in part for selfish reasons. It helps me understand what's happening much better.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I mean, there's also the local business aspect, I think, is fascinating. You know, what sort of decisions businesses are making based upon what they think is going to happen with the Trump presidency. A lot of the issues that both Elisabeth and Scott brought up. I mean, with healthcare, with tax reform, you know, these businesses are having to make really big decisions based upon what they think is going to happen. So, I mean, that's a very fascinating story, I think, at the local level.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about verifying sources and verifying information and whether that's changed over the past, I guess, 8 to 10 months. So the way that this White House disseminates information is pretty chaotic, and you know, sometimes the press secretary will say something and then the president will say something different. And the president has even said that he, you know, his own staff can't keep up with him. And there are different White House officials saying things to the media or wanting to undercut each other. So how are you navigating this, and how are you advising your reporters to make sure that they're not just being spun in certain ways, or to even trust what the press secretary is telling them is verifiable information? Elizabeth?
You know, all of us know that when we get information from somebody, background information, the first question I already ask is, what is the person's motive here? What is the agenda here? No one speaks to the New York Times out of the goodness of his or her heart, right? Everybody has a reason. And then, you know, we've had many situations where we've heard one thing from one White House advisor and another thing from an equally powerful White House advisor, and you're just stuck with, okay, what are we going to do? Sometimes you just say, this part of the White House is saying that, part of the White House is saying the other thing. But I think as long, and the other problem too is this crowd does have, you know, we all know that now, and you just have to, we've been burned a number of times, and you just have to be super careful and ask a lot of questions. We have a rule here too that we always have to know the source by name, that either me or Bill Hamilton, the Washington editor of the Times. We have to know who the source is, and we have to approve all the external sources. That helps a lot because, you know, again, if you know who it is, you know the motive. I'm trying to think on the decision on NAFTA, we had completely opposite information at 2 different times in the day. I bet both of you remember this. At one point, Trump was going to get out of NAFTA. That was in the morning, and then in the afternoon he wasn't. I remember getting a call from New York and saying, what is going on here? What is wrong with your stories? I said, well, in the morning this was true, and in the afternoon what we wrote was also true. So, and then, again, there were so many shifting alliances and so much chaos inside the White House. It's very dangerous to report dangerous journalistically, and you to make sure you're always accurate.
Scott?
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit to that, you also have the problem of talking to you know, senior White House officials who are in the right meetings and talking to the right people and advising the president, who themselves may have no idea what's going on. And so you're, you know, in the past, I covered the White House, I know Elisabeth covered the White House. You sort of felt like if you were talking to this group of 5 or 6 people in any White House who really, really know what's happening, that you had a pretty good sense of what was going on. In this one, you can't. And it's and not to mention the fact that ultimately, we know that Donald Trump is going to make his own decision, and it may reflect, it may not even be close to what the advice he's getting from even his most trusted advisors. So it makes it extremely hard. I mean, we had an example, at least we learned this very early on in the transition around the General Mattis appointment as Defense Secretary. Dan Lamothe got a scoop. The deal was done. He's appointed. He's, it's going to happen at any moment. We run it at the top of our website. We're going to lead the paper with it. And everyone's having a pretty hard time matching it, which starts to make us a little bit nervous. Dan says, I have two sources, they're the right people, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think it was one of Trump's communications people on his airplane tweets that it's not true, no decision's been made. We're getting worried that maybe we don't know. And Trump lands at an event and immediately announces Mattis, which apparently surprised everybody because he really hadn't made the decision yet. So in some ways we weren't right, but we turned out to be right, luckily. And we heard later that General Mattis literally learned that he'd been officially offered the job from Trump's speech. So sort of all bets are off sometimes, and it was a great lesson for us. And I'm glad that we weren't wrong. Obviously, Dan was right. Dan did hear from the right people. Eventually, the president followed through. But it was a pretty alarming, it was an eye-opening moment for us to say, even when you think you're talking to exactly the people that know, they may not know. And so the care we have to take with that is extraordinary.
Yeah. We've also, we've had a number of experiences too with just the, as Elisabeth was talking about, the different agendas that different parts of the White House will have. This has been a White House that has very clear factions in it, and a lot of people that at times are undermining each other. You want to make sure that you're not being a tool of someone's agenda or being that vehicle for what they're trying to do to undermine a colleague. And it doesn't mean sometimes that some of the information is not true, but is it getting warped in a way? And so trying to make sure that you are getting the multiple sides of the story and painting as accurate of a picture as possible. And, a lot of times when you've got 3 high-level White House sources saying something, that's really, really solid. But, it does require additional vetting, a lot of times additional reporting to make sure that you do have the full picture. I think with a lot of the major decisions that we've seen, whether it be individual departures from the White House, how decisions have been made about climate change, about the Paris Accord, about NAFTA, there will be a lot of conflicting information right up to the moment, as Scott was saying, right up into the moment that Trump decides, because you have these different factions of the White House that are lobbying Trump to do different things. So, it doesn't mean a lot of times you can tell one side of the story. That's definitely not wrong. But is it the full picture? So trying to get that, cover the landscape is quite the challenge sometimes.
Great, thank you. So I, of course, have to ask this question from the AAJ president, Yvonne Liao, as her senior VP. But here's a question that has to do with Trump and also coverage or about diversity. So as a journalism organization, we keep getting questions from people asking, is diversity taking a back seat because newsrooms have new great challenges covering the new administration? I always say that newsrooms can walk and chew gum at the same time, but I'm wondering what you're doing to make sure that diversity is still a focus for your newsrooms.
Yeah, we have a very robust recruiting operation. I would argue that in recent months, we've actually stepped up our focus on diversity and making sure that we've got the proper recruiting mechanisms in place. That also within that, diversity is something that we have discussions about. That everyone has certainly opportunities to advance in the newsroom. But I think recruiting is definitely one of the biggest challenges, and just encouraging people from all different viewpoints and ethnicities and backgrounds to come into the newsroom. And I would also argue that the Trump presidency makes that even more important, that you do have a lot of different viewpoints, that you don't get into some sort of groupthink mentality within the newsroom, about how to cover this presidency. So if anything, I think it's become more robust.
I mean, I would definitely agree with that. Recruiting, we've stepped up a lot. I mean, and rather than taking a back seat, in many ways, I know what's happened here is that because our business is so much better, we are spending a lot more money on recruiting. And so it's beneficial. When we went through a period of real contraction 5, 6, 7 years ago, and our really strong newsroom personnel staff that was in charge of really national recruiting efforts vanished. We're building that back, and we've spent a lot of money. We spend a lot of money on recruiting now. So in that way, the Trump presidency has actually been quite good for diversity hiring and diversity recruiting from us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've been hiring a lot in Washington, and diversity is really important to me and to the rest of the Times. And I think if you came into the Washington Bureau, it looks quite a bit different than it did a few years ago. So I'm very proud of that.
Great. So I'd like to end on a positive note because we've talked a lot about challenges, and there's an audience question that seems to be a really good fit, which is, what innovations have the new administration spurred for your newsroom, and what opportunities are you excited about over the next 4 to 8 years?
Hard one.
Yeah.
Karey?
Oh, Elizabeth, go ahead.
I can just say the innovations, well, we post had this, but it certainly created a fact check reporter job for us. That's an innovation for us. It has, it's pushed more data journalism, more graphics. I think that even that, just the hunger for more information and hardcore facts about Trump. We use more video now than we ever did, again, because of the interest, partly because of the interest in Trump. I would say that would be, and then again, the use of more social media. I mean, we have a huge social media team and an audience development team, and so that, because of the interest in Trump, has just spurred us on even more. Using it as a moment to develop that. 8 or 10 years.
So we've had
somebody smarter can answer the rest of that question.
And we've built up some additional operations and interactive data team. Some other that kind of further the magazine and such to just be able to tell the Trump presidency through other forms, other narratives. I would say one of the most interesting things I think that the Trump presidency has done is brought a lot more engagement in the newsroom. I think throughout the newsroom as well, there are so many good stories to tell with this presidency. And we've got our pro kind of policy operation that they've got amazing stories to tell at these agencies. They often can pair up with the White House team, maybe pair up with the Congress team. So in some ways, it's kind of, not that we were incredibly siloed before, but that it's brought, reporters from different teams working together on these bigger stories, whether it be kind of the healthcare debate where it's the spot coverage, or it be these bigger enterprise investigative stories. So I think the level of engagement with the reporters to the story and the reporters with each other has been really inspiring to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with all that. We're just expanding in a number of different ways, an emphasis on different kinds of storytelling. Michelle, your own team obviously now has a video fact checker, which is interesting and I know is doing very well in the social media world. And I think that the innovation is being driven by the pace and the way people are getting their news, of course. But I also wouldn't forget one thing that I'm very happy about is that we've invested in some of the old school stuff too. It's not the national staff; it's the investigative staff. But we added 7 reporters and an editor to a rapid response investigative team to start this year. Something that was in the works, frankly, before Trump was elected. But just the sort of strengthening our reporting ability at a time where in my view. It's a biased one, but reporting is more important than it's been in a long time. So the innovation has been great, and I think we'll keep pushing in the direction of visual and graphic storytelling, and the video team is expanding enormously. But I'm also really gratified that we're spending money on reporting.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to Elisabeth Bumiller of the New York Times, Karey Van Hall of Politico, Scott Wilson of the Washington Post. And thank you, everybody, for joining the Google Hangout, and to ASNE for having us today. And please remember to register for the upcoming ASNE convention in Washington, D.C. from October 8th through October 11th. And I'm Michelle Lee from the Washington Post, and thanks for joining us.